The cold steel of a revolver pressed against Grace Jones's temple as she stood frozen in the dusty general store of Willow Creek, Colorado. The year was 1876, and she had just been accused of stealing a priceless diamond brooch that belonged to the mayor's wife. "I never took anything," Grace insisted, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Her emerald eyes scanned the crowd that had gathered around her, searching for a single sympathetic face among them. She found none. "We caught you red-handed, girl," Sheriff Barton growled, his weathered face contorted with disgust. "Mayor's wife saw you eyeing that brooch yesterday, and now it's gone missing. Your kind always wants what you can't have." Grace felt her cheeks burn with indignation. By her kind, the sheriff meant poor folks specifically, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had died of fever 3 years prior, leaving her to fend for herself at the age of 19. She had worked honest jobs ever since, most recently as a seamstress for Mrs. Patterson, the very woman now accusing her of theft. "I was admiring it, not coveting it," Grace explained, struggling to keep her voice from trembling. "I'm a seamstress. I appreciate fine craftsmanship." "Save your lies for the judge," Sheriff Barton sneered, grabbing her roughly by the arm. "You'll hang for this, mark my words." The crowd parted as the sheriff dragged Grace toward the jailhouse. Whispers followed her like shadows: thief, criminal. Never did trust her, cutting deeper than any physical wound could. As they stepped onto the dusty main street, a tall figure on horseback blocked their path. The late afternoon sun silhouetted the rider, casting his face in shadow. All Grace could make out was his broad shoulders and the distinctive Stetson hat that marked him as a cowboy. "Sheriff," the man called out, his voice deep and commanding, "I believe you're making a mistake." Sheriff Barton stopped, his grip on Grace's arm tightening painfully. "This ain't your business, Everett. Move along." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, and as he stepped forward, Grace got her first clear look at him. He was tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through the sheriff's bravado. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his hat, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his strong jawline. "Zachary Everett," the sheriff said with disdain. "I heard you were back in town. Didn't think you'd be foolish enough to interfere with the law on your first day back." "It's not interference when you're arresting an innocent woman," Zach replied calmly, his eyes flicking briefly to Grace before returning to the sheriff. "And how would you know she's innocent?" Barton challenged. A small smile played at the corner of Zach's mouth. "Because I was in Mrs. Patterson's house this morning, delivering a package from my employer. I saw the brooch sitting plain as day on her dressing table, where she'd forgotten it after last night's dinner party. She's probably realized her mistake by now." The crowd began to murmur, and Sheriff Barton's face reddened. "You calling Mrs. Patterson a liar?" "I'm saying she made a mistake," Zach corrected smoothly. "And I'd testify to what I saw under oath if need be." Grace's heart hammered in her chest as she looked up at this stranger who had come to her defense. Why would he risk himself for her? She'd never even met him before. The standoff continued for several tense seconds before a breathless young boy came running down the street. Sheriff Barton, Mrs. Patterson sent me. She found her brooch under her pillow. Says she must have put it there for safekeeping and forgotten." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Sheriff Barton's grip on Grace's arm loosened, but his scowl deepened. "Lucky for you," he muttered, releasing her with a slight shove. As the crowd dispersed, Grace found herself standing alone with her unexpected savior. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. "Thank you," she said simply, rubbing her arm where the sheriff's fingers had left red marks. Zach Everett tipped his hat slightly. "Zachary Everett. Most folks call me Zach." "Grace Jones," she replied, offering her hand. "Most folks around here call me Thief, apparently." His hand engulfed hers, calloused but gentle. People in small towns jump to conclusions, especially about those they see as different. And you don't. "I've seen enough of the world to know things aren't always what they seem." He released her hand and gestured to his horse. "Can I escort you home? Seems like you've had enough excitement for one day." Grace hesitated. Her tiny room above the laundry was hardly something she wanted to show a stranger, especially one who had just saved her from jail. But the alternative was walking alone through town, facing the stares and whispers of people who had been ready to see her hang moments ago. "That's kind of you, Mr. Everett, but, Zach," he corrected. "Zach," she acknowledged with a small smile. "I appreciate the offer, but I can manage." He studied her for a moment, respect flickering in his eyes. "As you wish, Miss Jones. But the offer stands if you change your mind." As he turned to mount his horse, Grace surprised herself by asking, "Why did you help me? You don't know me." Zach paused, one foot in the stirrup. "I know what it's like to be judged unfairly," he said quietly, "and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen to someone else." With that, he swung into the saddle and tipped his hat once more before riding away, leaving Grace with more questions than answers about the mysterious cowboy who had just saved her from disaster. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a welcome respite from the previous day's drama. Grace arrived at Mrs. Patterson's house early, as she did every Tuesday and Thursday to work on the lady's extensive wardrobe. She braced herself for an awkward encounter, or worse, dismissal. To her surprise, Mrs. Patterson greeted her with unusual warmth. "Grace, my dear, I am so terribly sorry about yesterday's misunderstanding. I was absolutely mortified when I found my brooch. Sheriff Barton assures me you were treated with the utmost respect during the confusion." Grace spit back a bitter retort. The sheriff's revolver against her temple had hardly been respectful, but arguing would only cost her a job she desperately needed. "It's forgotten, madam," she lied politely. "Wonderful." Mrs. Patterson clapped her plump hands together. "Now, I've been thinking about my green silk. It needs taking in at the waist. I've lost weight, you see." She patted her ample midsection, which showed no evidence of any such reduction. As Grace settled into her work, Mrs. Patterson continued chattering. "I hear Zachary Everett was quite the knight in shining armor yesterday. Such a handsome man, though his family history is complicated." Grace's fingers stilled on the fabric. His family history? Oh my, yes. The Everetts were once the wealthiest family in the county before the war. His father lost everything gambling, then shot himself when Zachary was just a boy. The mother died of grief shortly after. Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Zachary left town at 16, and no one knew what became of him until he showed up working for the Millbrook Ranch last year." Quite the fall from grace, wouldn't you say? Grace thought it sounded more like resilience than disgrace, but she kept that observation to herself. "He seems like a good man," she said neutrally. "Oh, I suppose," Mrs. Patterson sniffed. "Though one wonders why he was so quick to defend you. Perhaps he has his eye on you, my dear. Though I must warn you, a man with his background is hardly suitable marriage material." Grace nearly pricked her finger in surprise. "I hardly know the man, Mrs. Patterson. He was simply doing the right thing." "If you say so, dear." Mrs. Patterson's tone made it clear she believed otherwise. "Though I must say, if my Catherine weren't already engaged to Dr. Wilson's son, I might have considered Zachary. He has his father's good looks, if not his fortune." Grace continued her work in silence, trying to ignore the way her pulse had quickened at the mention of Zach's name. She had more important things to worry about than a handsome cowboy, like how to repair her reputation in a town that had been all too willing to believe the worst of her. As she walked home that evening, a soft rain began to fall, quickly turning the dusty street to mud. Grace hurried her steps, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The sound of hoofbeats behind her made her turn, and there was Zachary Everett on his chestnut gelding, looking as if he'd materialized from her thoughts. "Miss Jones," he called, slowing his horse to match her pace. "You'll catch your death in this weather." "I'm nearly home," she replied, though home was still several blocks away, and her thin shoes were already soaked through. Without warning, Zach dismounted and removed his long duster coat. "At least take this," he said, draping it around her shoulders before she could protest. The coat enveloped her in warmth and the scent of leather, tobacco, and something uniquely him. "Thank you," she said, "but now you'll get wet." He smiled, revealing a dimple in his left cheek that made her heart flutter traitorously. "I've weathered worse storms than this." They walked in companionable silence for a few moments, Zach leading his horse with one hand. Finally, Grace asked the question that had been on her mind since Mrs. Patterson's gossip session. "Why did you come back to Willow Creek? Mrs. Patterson mentioned you left years ago." Zach's expression tightened slightly. "People talk, I see. Small towns." Grace shrugged apologetically. I came back because Millbrook offered good work, and—" he hesitated. "Because it was time to face the past, I suppose." "That takes courage," Grace said softly. "Says the woman who stood her ground against false accusations with a gun to her head," he countered. They reached the laundry building, and Grace reluctantly removed his coat. "This is me," she said, handing it back. "Thank you again." Zach took the coat, but made no move to leave. "Miss Jones, Grace, I was wondering if you might join me for supper tomorrow evening? The hotel serves a decent meal." The invitation caught her off guard. No one in Willow Creek had ever asked her to dine with them, certainly not an unmarried man. It wasn't proper, especially for someone like her with no family to chaperone. But the sincerity in his eyes made her hesitate. "I don't think that would be wise," she said finally. "People already talk enough about me, and after yesterday." Understanding crossed his face. "Of course. I didn't think—" "No, it's kind of you to ask," Grace assured him. "Perhaps another time, when the town has found someone else to gossip about." He smiled, but she could see the disappointment he tried to hide. "Another time, then. Good night, Grace." "Good night, Zach." As she climbed the narrow stairs to her room, Grace wondered if she had made a mistake. But a woman in her position couldn't afford to court more scandal, especially with a man whose own reputation in town was questionable at best. Still, as she changed into her nightgown and crawled into her narrow bed, she couldn't help but remember the warmth of his coat around her shoulders and the kindness in his blue eyes. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace encountered Zach several times around town, at the general store, outside the post office, even once at church. Each time, he tipped his hat and greeted her politely, but made no further attempts to invite her to supper. She told herself it was for the best, even as she found herself lingering over her errands in hopes of seeing him. Spring was giving way to summer, and the annual Founders' Day celebration was approaching. The entire town would gather for a picnic and dance on the first Saturday in June, a tradition that dated back to Willow Creek's establishment 30 years prior. Grace had never attended before, preferring to avoid the sidelong glances and whispered comments that inevitably followed her at such gatherings. This year, however, Mrs. Patterson insisted she come. "You simply must, Grace. I've commissioned a new dress for the occasion, and I'll need you there in case any adjustments are required." Grace knew it was just an excuse. The dress she'd made for Mrs. Patterson was perfect, but she couldn't refuse her employer. So on the morning of the celebration, she donned her best dress, a simple blue cotton that she'd embellished with delicate embroidery around the collar and cuffs. The town square had been transformed with bunting and flowers. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family, and a small band was setting up on a wooden platform for the dancing that would follow the meal. Grace arrived early, as instructed, and helped Mrs. Patterson arrange her elaborate picnic display. "Oh, look, there's Zachary," Mrs. Patterson said suddenly, nodding toward the edge of the square. "He cleans up rather nicely, doesn't he?" Grace turned to see Zach talking with some of the ranch hands. He wore a crisp white shirt with a black vest and had clearly shaved for the occasion. His dark hair was neatly combed beneath his best hat, and even from a distance, Grace could see he stood out among the other men. As if sensing her gaze, Zach looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded square, and Grace felt a blush creep up her neck. He smiled and excused himself from his companions, making his way toward her. "Miss Jones," he greeted her formally, aware of Mrs. Patterson's keen interest. "You look lovely today." "Thank you, Mr. Everett," she replied with equal formality. "As do you." Mrs. Patterson beamed at them both. "Zachary, you simply must try my apple pie later. Grace, be a dear and fetch us some lemonade from the refreshment table." Recognizing the obvious ploy to separate them, Grace nonetheless obeyed, weaving through the crowd toward the refreshment table. She was filling 2 glasses when Sheriff Barton's deputy, a weaselly man named Hank Miller, stepped up beside her. "Well, if it ain't the Irish thief," he drawled, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Surprised you'd show your face here after what happened." Grace kept her eyes on the lemonade. "I was proven innocent, Deputy Miller." "Were you now? Or did your cowboy friend just lie to protect you?" His breath reeked of whiskey, though it was barely noon. "What did you do to get him to speak up for you, huh? Must have been something special." Fury and humiliation burned through Grace. Before she could respond, a strong hand gripped Miller's shoulder. "I suggest you apologize to the lady. Zach said quietly, his voice dangerously calm. Miller turned, his sneer faltering when he saw who had interrupted him. I was just making conversation, Everett. You were being disrespectful to Miss Jones, and by extension, questioning my integrity. Zach's grip tightened. Apologize. Now. The deputy glanced around, noticing they had drawn attention. Sorry, he muttered insincerely before yanking free of Zach's grip and stalking away. Grace stood frozen, the lemonade forgotten. Thank you, she whispered, but you shouldn't have done that. Now people will talk even more. Let them talk, Zach said firmly. I won't stand by while you're insulted, especially when I know the truth. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that went beyond words. The moment was broken by the mayor calling everyone to attention for his annual speech. As the crowd gathered around the mayor's platform, Zach leaned close to Grace. Save me a dance later, he asked softly. Prudence told her to refuse, but her heart had other ideas. One dance, she agreed, and was rewarded with a smile that made her forget all about Prudence. The mayor's speech droned on, followed by a blessing from the town preacher, and finally the announcement that the feast could begin. Grace returned to Mrs. Patterson's side, delivering the lemonade and helping serve the elaborate spread the woman had prepared. Throughout the meal, Grace was acutely aware of Zach's presence across the square, where he sat with the other ranch hands. Occasionally their eyes would meet, and each time, her heart would beat a little faster. As the afternoon wore on and the band began to play, couples moved to the dance area. Grace watched from her seat beside Mrs. Patterson, who was deep in conversation with the banker's wife about the scandalous cut of the dressmaker's daughter's neckline. May I have this dance? Zach's voice startled her from her thoughts. He stood before her, hand extended, ignoring the sudden silence in Mrs. Patterson's conversation. Grace hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. You may. He led her to the edge of the dancing area, away from the center where most couples twirled. As his hand settled at her waist, and he took her other hand in his, Grace was thankful for the proper distance between them mandated by the waltz. Even so, being this close to him made her dizzy in a way that had nothing to do with the dancing. I've been wanting to do this since I first saw you, Zach admitted quietly as they moved to the music. Dance with me? Grace asked, trying to keep her voice light. Be close to you, he corrected, his blue eyes serious. Get to know you better. Grace looked down, suddenly shy. There's not much to know. I'm just a seamstress. You're far more than that, he said, guiding her smoothly through a turn. You're brave, resilient, talented with a needle if Mrs. Patterson's new dress is any indication, and, he paused, you have the most beautiful smile I've ever seen on the rare occasions you share it. Grace couldn't help but smile at that, proving his point. You're quite the charmer, Mr. Everett. Only with you, he said, and she believed him. As the music drew to a close, neither moved to separate immediately. Thank you for the dance, Grace said finally. The pleasure was mine, Zach replied, reluctantly releasing her waist but keeping hold of her hand. Would it be too forward to ask for another? Before Grace could answer, a commotion near the refreshment table drew everyone's attention. Deputy Miller, clearly drunker than before, was arguing loudly with one of the Millbrook Ranch hands. Take it back, Miller shouted, shoving the other man. I ain't taking back the truth, the ranch hand retorted. You're a disgrace to that badge. Miller's hand went to his gun, and several women screamed. Zach immediately stepped in front of Grace protectively. Stay here, he ordered, moving swiftly toward the confrontation. Grace watched in horror as Zach positioned himself between the two men, his back to Miller. Calvin, back down, he said firmly to the ranch hand. He's not worth it. Listen to your friend, Calvin, Miller slurred, his gun now drawn but pointed at the ground. Run along like the coward you are. Zach turned to face the deputy. Put the gun away, Miller. You're drunk and making a fool of yourself. Am I? Miller sneered, raising the gun slightly. Or maybe I'm finally seeing things clearly. Like how you lied to protect your little Irish whore. The slur against Grace hit Zach like a physical blow. His eyes narrowed dangerously. Take that back, he said, his voice low and deadly. Miller laughed. Make me, Everett. Or are you afraid to admit you're sweet on damaged goods? What happened next was so fast that Grace barely registered it. Zach moved with lightning speed, disarming Miller before the drunk could react. The gun went off as they struggled, the bullet harmlessly hitting the ground, but the sound caused panic. People scattered, women grabbed children, and in the confusion, no one saw Miller pull a knife from his boot and slash wildly at Zach. Grace screamed as she saw blood bloom on Zach's shirt. He staggered back, clutching his side, but still managed to land a solid punch that dropped Miller to the ground. Sheriff Barton finally pushed through the crowd, taking in the scene with wide eyes. "What in tarnation is going on here?" he demanded, looking from his unconscious deputy to Zach, who was now pale but still standing. "Your deputy pulled a gun at a family gathering," Calvin the ranch hand spoke up. Then when Zach disarmed him, he pulled a knife. Slashed him good. Other witnesses quickly confirmed the story, and Sheriff Barton's face darkened with anger and embarrassment. "Someone get Doc Wilson," he ordered, kneeling beside Miller to check him. Grace rushed to Zach's side, heedless of propriety. "You're hurt," she said, gently pulling his hand away to examine the wound. The cut was long but didn't appear too deep, slicing across his ribs. "It's nothing," Zach insisted, though his grimace belied his words. "Don't be foolish," Grace scolded, pressing her handkerchief against the wound. "You need the doctor." Doc Wilson arrived and insisted on taking Zach to his office immediately. As two ranch hands helped Zach walk, he looked back at Grace. "Rain, check on that second dance," he called, attempting a smile despite his pain. Grace couldn't help but laugh, even as tears threatened. "Absolutely," she promised. The Founders' Day celebration ended abruptly after the incident. Grace helped Mrs. Patterson pack up her things, enduring the woman's endless speculation about what had happened and why. As soon as she could, Grace excused herself and hurried to Doc Wilson's office. She hesitated outside the door, suddenly uncertain. What was she doing? She had no claim on Zach, no right to check on him. But the memory of his blood on her hands drove her to knock anyway. Doc Wilson's wife answered, her eyebrows rising at the sight of Grace. "Miss Jones, can I help you?" "I wanted to inquire about Mr. Everett's condition," Grace said formally. Mrs. Wilson gave her a knowing look. "He's resting. The cut required 12 stitches, but he'll recover fully with time. My husband gave him something for the pain, so he's sleeping now." "Oh," Grace tried to hide her disappointment. "Would you please tell him I came by when he wakes?" "Of course, dear," Mrs. Wilson said kindly. "Though I suspect he'd rather hear it from you directly. Why don't you come back tomorrow? He should be more alert by then." Grace nodded gratefully. "I will. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson." As she turned to leave, Mrs. Wilson added, "He asked for you, you know." "Just before the laudanum took effect. Wanted to make sure you were all right." A warm feeling spread through Grace's chest. "Did he?" Mrs. Wilson smiled. "He did. Quite insistently." With those words to sustain her, Grace returned to her small room. She should have been exhausted after the day's events, but sleep eluded her. All she could think about was Zach, the feel of his hand at her waist, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the way he had stepped between her and danger without hesitation. It was foolish to allow herself these feelings, she knew. Nothing could come of it. She was a penniless orphan with a questionable reputation, and despite his current circumstances, Zachary Everett came from one of the founding families of Willow Creek. Surely he could do better than her. Yet the memory of his words, "You're far more than that," gave her a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he saw something in her that others did not. Morning came after a restless night, and Grace rose early for church. She sat in her usual spot at the back, half listening to Reverend Thompson's sermon about forgiveness while watching the door for any sign of Zach. He didn't appear, which wasn't surprising given his injury, but disappointment settled in her stomach nonetheless. After the service, she made her way to Doc Wilson's house. The doctor himself answered this time, looking tired but pleased to see her. "Miss Jones, come in. My patient has been asking for you all morning." Grace followed him through the front parlor to a small bedroom at the back of the house. Zach was propped up against pillows, his torso wrapped in white bandages. He looked pale, but his face brightened when he saw her. "Grace," he said, starting to sit up straighter and then wincing at the movement. "Careful," Doc Wilson cautioned. "Those stitches need time to heal. Miss Jones, please ensure he doesn't exert himself. I need to check on another patient, but I'll be back shortly." With that, the doctor left them alone, the door significantly ajar for propriety's sake. Grace moved to sit in the chair beside the bed, suddenly shy. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I tangled with a mountain lion," Zach admitted with a rueful smile. "But Doc says I'll live." "You were very brave," Grace said softly. "And very foolish." "Probably," he agreed. "But I couldn't let him talk about you that way." Grace looked down at her hands. "People have said worse about me. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be," Zach said firmly. He reached out, gently taking one of her hands in his. "Grace, I need to tell you something." Her heart skipped a beat at his serious tone. "What is it?" "I didn't just happen to be at Mrs. Patterson's house that day," he confessed. "I went there specifically because I knew you worked for her. I'd seen you around town, always keeping to yourself, always working so hard. I wanted to meet you properly." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "You sought me out?" "What?" "Because from the moment I first saw you, I couldn't look away," he said simply. "There's something about you, Grace Jones. Something that calls to me like nothing ever has." Her cheeks warmed at his words. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he insisted, his fingers tightening around hers. "I know you're strong enough to face this town's judgment with your head held high. I know you're kind enough to check on an injured man who has no claim on your time. And I know I want the chance to discover everything else about you, if you'll let me." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this before, like she was something precious, something worth knowing. "People will talk," she warned. "Let them," Zach said firmly. "I've never cared much for other people's opinions. Your reputation is already complicated, as I'm sure you've heard." His smile was wry. "Grace, I've spent 10 years running from my past, from this town's memories of my father's disgrace. Coming back here, I promised myself I wouldn't hide anymore. And that includes not hiding how I feel about you." Grace could scarcely breathe. "And how do you feel?" "Like I've been wandering in the desert and finally found water," he said softly. "Like something that was missing has suddenly appeared. I can't explain it better than that." A tear slipped down her cheek, and Zach reached up to brush it away, his touch infinitely gentle. "I'm not asking for promises," he continued. "Just a chance. Will you give me that?" Grace knew she should be cautious, should protect her heart from the inevitable pain when he realized she wasn't what he thought. But looking into his earnest blue eyes, she couldn't find the strength to deny what her own heart wanted. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll give you that chance." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, bright and warming. "Then as soon as Doc Wilson releases me, I'm taking you on a proper picnic. No townspeople, no Deputy Miller, just us." "I'd like that," Grace admitted, returning his smile with one of her own. The sound of footsteps in the hallway warned them of Doc Wilson's return, and Grace reluctantly withdrew her hand from Zach's. The doctor entered with a knowing look that suggested he wasn't fooled by their sudden propriety. "Miss Jones, I hope you can convince this stubborn man to rest properly," he said. "He seems determined to get back to work far sooner than is advisable." "I'll do my best, doctor," Grace promised, giving Zach a stern look. "Though he does seem rather headstrong." "You have no idea," Zach replied with a grin that made her heart flutter. Doc Wilson checked Zach's bandages and pronounced himself satisfied with the healing so far. "Another day or two of rest, and you can return to your room at the boarding house," he advised. "But no heavy work for at least 2 weeks. Those stitches need time." Zach nodded, though Grace could tell he wasn't pleased with the restriction. After the doctor left again, she said, "He's right, you know. You need to heal properly." "I know," Zach sighed. "It's just that Mr. Millbrook is counting on me to help with the cattle drive preparations." "The cattle can wait," Grace said firmly. "Your health can't." He studied her face for a moment, then smiled. "Yes, madam." The formal madam made her laugh. "I'm hardly old enough to be madam to you." "No," he agreed, his eyes warm. "You're exactly the right age to be something else entirely to me." The implication in his words made her blush again. "You're too forward, Mr. Everett. Only with you." He repeated his words from their dance. "Only ever with you." Grace stayed until Mrs. Wilson gently suggested it was time for Zach to rest. As she prepared to leave, Zach caught her hand once more. "Come back tomorrow?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice that touched her deeply. "I will," she promised. "After work." True to her word, Grace returned to Doc Wilson's house the following evening, and the evening after that. Each visit deepened their connection as they shared stories of their lives. Zach's decade of wandering from Texas to Montana, working as a cowhand and occasionally a bounty hunter. Grace's childhood in the mining camps where her father had sought his fortune, her mother's patient teaching of reading and sewing, the fever that had taken them both within days of each other. By the time Doc Wilson declared Zach well enough to leave his care, 5 days had passed, and Grace knew with certainty that what she felt for Zachary Everett was unlike anything she had experienced before. It frightened her in its intensity, yet she couldn't bring herself to pull away. On his first day of freedom, Zach arrived at Mrs. Patterson's house just as Grace was finishing her work. Mrs. Patterson, whose attitude toward Zach had warmed considerably since he had become the town hero for subduing Deputy Miller, invited him in for tea with elaborate casualness. "I understand you'll be escorting our Grace on a picnic," she said, her tone making it clear she considered herself responsible for the match. "If she'll still have me," Zach replied, smiling at Grace over his teacup. "Of course she will," Mrs. Patterson answered before Grace could speak. "Though as her employer, I must insist you have her back at a reasonable hour. A young woman's reputation is a fragile thing. I assure you, Mrs. Patterson, Miss Jones's reputation is safe with me," Zach said solemnly, though his eyes danced with amusement as they met Grace's. Once they had escaped Mrs. Patterson's well-meaning supervision, Zach helped Grace onto his horse. He mounted behind her, his arms encircling her waist as he took the reins. The closeness was both thrilling and terrifying, his chest warm against her back. "Is this proper?" Grace asked, though she made no move to create distance between them. "Probably not," Zach admitted cheerfully. "But it's practical, and I promise to be a gentleman." He guided the horse out of town and along the river, to a peaceful spot beneath a cottonwood tree. A blanket and picnic basket were already waiting, prepared by the hotel cook at Zach's request. "I hope you don't mind the simple fare," he said as he helped her down from the horse. "My cooking skills are limited to coffee and beans over a campfire." Grace laughed. "After years of my own cooking, anything I don't have to prepare myself is a feast." They settled on the blanket, and Zach unpacked bread, cheese, cold chicken, and a bottle of cider. It was indeed simple, but to Grace, it was perfect. The rushing of the river provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation, which flowed as easily as the water. As the afternoon sun began its descent, casting golden light through the cottonwood's leaves, Zach's expression grew more serious. "Grace, there's something I need to tell you." Her heart stuttered with sudden anxiety. "What is it?" "I've been offered a job," he said, watching her face carefully. "A good one, with the potential for partnership if things go well." "That's wonderful," Grace said, genuinely happy for him. "With Millbrook Ranch?" "No," he hesitated. "It's with a cattle operation in Wyoming territory. The owner's an old friend who needs a foreman he can trust." The implications hit Grace like a physical blow. Wyoming was hundreds of miles away. "When would you leave?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "That's the thing," Zach said, taking her hand. "I haven't given my answer yet. Because it depends on you." Grace stared at him in confusion. "On me? Why would your job depend on me?" Zach took a deep breath. "Because I don't want to go anywhere without you, Grace Jones. These past weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you, it's shown me what I want for my future. And that future includes you, if you'll have me." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What exactly are you saying, Zach?" He shifted closer, taking both her hands in his. "I'm saying I love you, Grace. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you standing up to Sheriff Barton, refusing to break even with a gun to your head. I know it's fast, and I know you probably think I'm crazy, but I love you too," Grace interrupted, the words escaping before she could consider their wisdom. Zach's eyes widened, and a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. "You do?" Grace nodded, suddenly shy. "I do. Though you're right, it is fast, and I am a little scared by how much I feel for you." "We can take our time," he assured her, bringing her hands to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I don't need to give my answer to Jim for another month. We can use that time to be sure." "And then what?" Grace asked. "If we are sure?" Zach's gaze was steady and serious. "Then I'll ask you properly to be my wife, and if you say yes, we'll go to Wyoming together to start a new life. A place where no one knows us as the disgraced Everett boy or the Irish thief. Just Zach and Grace, building something of our own." The vision he painted was so beautiful it made her ache. A fresh start, away from the whispers and judgment of Willow Creek. A life with this man who looked at her like she was the answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was saying. "It sounds like a dream," she admitted. "It doesn't have to be just a dream," Zach said earnestly. "Say you'll consider it, at least." Grace looked into his hopeful blue eyes and found she couldn't deny him or herself this chance at happiness. "I'll consider it," she promised. "But Zach, are you sure? I have nothing to bring to a marriage. No money, no family connections, not even a good name in this town." "You have everything I want," he said simply. "Your strength, your kindness, your heart. The rest is just details." He leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips, giving her the chance to pull back. Instead, Grace closed the distance between them, pressing her mouth to his in a kiss that was tentative at first, then grew in confidence as his arms encircled her. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably get you back before Mrs. Patterson sends out a search party," he murmured reluctantly. Grace laughed softly. "Probably, though I'm tempted to risk her wrath for a few more minutes with you." "There will be many more minutes," Zach promised, helping her to her feet. "A lifetime of them, if I have my way." As they rode back to town, Grace leaning against Zach's chest with his arms secure around her, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, this was real. That this man truly loved her, that a future together was possible. It wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, judgments, practical concerns to address. But for the first time since her parents' deaths, Grace felt hope blooming in her heart, not just for survival, but for happiness. The following weeks were the happiest of Grace's life. Zach courted her properly, taking her to church on Sundays, escorting her on walks through town, and bringing her small gifts: a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry, wildflowers gathered from the prairie. Each evening, he would walk her to the laundry building and leave her with a kiss that grew more passionate as their feelings deepened. The town's attitude toward them was mixed. Some, like Mrs. Patterson, viewed the romance with approval, seeing it as a charming story of redemption for both the disgraced Everett boy and the orphaned seamstress. Others, particularly those who had been quickest to condemn Grace as a thief, whispered that she had somehow trapped or tricked Zach into his affections. Sheriff Barton, embarrassed by his deputy's actions and facing pressure from the town council, had fired Miller and made a public apology to Grace for the false accusation. Miller had left town shortly after, but not before spreading vicious rumors about Grace and Zach that lingered like a bad smell. 3 weeks after their picnic, as the deadline for Zach's decision about the Wyoming job approached, disaster struck. Grace was working late at Mrs. Patterson's, finishing a special dress for the banker's daughter's wedding, when a commotion outside drew her attention. Looking out the window, she saw flames leaping from the direction of the laundry building and her room above it. She ran from the house without a word to Mrs. Patterson, racing through the streets toward the fire. A crowd had already gathered, men forming a bucket brigade from the town well to the burning building. But it was clear their efforts were too little, too late. The old wooden structure was engulfed, flames shooting through the roof where her small room had been. Grace stood frozen in horror, watching as everything she owned burned. It wasn't much: some clothes, her mother's Bible, a few treasured mementos, but it was all she had. Tears streamed down her face as she realized she was once again left with nothing. "Grace!" Zach's voice cut through her shock. He pushed through the crowd to reach her, pulling her into his arms. "Thank God you're safe. When I saw the fire and knew it was your building, everything's gone," she whispered against his chest. "Everything." He held her tighter. "Things can be replaced. You can't." As they stood watching the fire, Sheriff Barton approached them, his expression grim. "Miss Jones, Mr. Everett. I'm afraid this fire wasn't an accident." Grace pulled back to look at him. "What do you mean?" "Several witnesses saw someone lurking around the building just before the fire started," Barton explained. "And we found a whiskey bottle with a rag stuffed in it behind the laundry. Someone set this fire deliberately." Zach's arm tightened around Grace's waist. "Who would do such a thing?" Sheriff Barton hesitated. "We can't be certain yet, but it was Miller, wasn't it?" Zach interrupted, his voice hard. The sheriff nodded slowly. "He was seen in town earlier today, drunk and making threats. Said he was going to teach that Irish girl a lesson." Grace felt sick. Because of what happened at Founder's Day? That was weeks ago. Some men nurse grudges, Barton said grimly. Especially men like Miller who blame others for their own failings. I've sent riders out to look for him, but he's likely fled the territory by now. As the reality of her situation sank in, Grace began to tremble. Where would she go? What would she do? Mrs. Patterson might offer her a place temporarily, but she couldn't impose indefinitely. You'll stay with Mrs. Wilson, Zach decided, as if reading her thoughts. She mentioned just yesterday that she could use help with her children while she assists the doctor. You can work for your room and board until we sort things out. Grace looked up at him gratefully. Thank you. Later that night, after Zach had escorted her to the Wilsons' home and made sure she was settled, he took her hands in his. This changes things, he said quietly. Grace's heart sank. Of course it did. Who would want to marry a woman who brought such trouble with her? I understand if you want to reconsider. No, Zach interrupted firmly. That's not what I meant. I meant that there's no reason to wait anymore. Grace, I love you. I want to marry you as soon as possible and take you to Wyoming, away from the memories and pain of this place. Hope flared in her chest, but caution tempered it. Zach, are you sure? This isn't just pity because of the fire. Pity. He looked genuinely confused. Grace, I've been counting the days until I could properly ask you to be my wife. The only reason I've waited is because I didn't want to rush you. He cupped her face gently. But if you need more time, I'll wait. However long it takes. Looking into his sincere blue eyes, Grace found she didn't want to wait either. Life was too uncertain, too fragile to postpone happiness when it was within reach. I don't need more time, she whispered. Ask me now. Zach's eyes widened, then softened with love. Without hesitation, he dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands. Grace Jones, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Will you come with me to Wyoming and build a life together? Will you let me love you for the rest of our days? Tears filled Grace's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. His answering smile was radiant as he rose and gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. When they finally broke apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. We'll be married before we leave, he promised. I want everyone in this town to know you're my wife before we go. A week later, Grace stood beside Zach in Reverend Thompson's small church, exchanging vows before a surprisingly large gathering of townspeople. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on providing a wedding dress, hastily altered from one of her daughter's gowns. Doc and Mrs. Wilson stood as witnesses, their children serving as impromptu flower girl and ring bearer. Even Sheriff Barton attended, bringing news that Miller had been captured trying to cross into New Mexico territory and would stand trial for arson. It was a relief to know he would face justice, though Grace found she could spare little thought for him on this day of all days. As Zach slipped a simple gold band onto her finger purchased with money he'd saved for their fresh start in Wyoming and promised to love and cherish her until death parted them, Grace felt the last shadows of her past receding. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them man and wife, and Zach kissed her as the congregation applauded, she knew she had found her home not in a place, but in a person. The small reception at the hotel afterward was a merrier affair than Grace could have imagined. Even those who had once whispered about her came to offer congratulations, perhaps moved by the romantic story of the cowboy who had proved her innocence and won her heart, or perhaps simply swept up in the joyous atmosphere. As they prepared to leave the next morning for the long journey to Wyoming, Zach handed Grace up into the wagon he had purchased for their trip. Their belongings were few: Zach's saddle and gear, a trunk of new clothes for Grace bought with wedding gift money, supplies for the journey, and a special surprise from Mrs. Patterson, a quilting frame and fabric to start their new home. Ready, Mrs. Everett? Zach asked, climbing up beside her and taking the reins. The her new name sent a thrill through Grace. Ready, Mr. Everett, she replied, leaning against his shoulder. As they drove out of Willow Creek, past the charred remains of the laundry building and toward the open prairie beyond, Grace felt no regret at leaving. This town had branded her a thief, had taken nearly everything from her, but in doing so, it had also given her the greatest gift: the man beside her who had seen her truth when no one else would look. What are you thinking about? Zach asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Grace smiled. looking ahead to the horizon where their future waited. I was thinking that sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find what really matters. Zach's arm tightened around her. And what matters to you, Grace Everett? You, she said simply. Us. The life we're going to build together. His answering smile was all the reassurance she needed that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, the cowboy who had proved her innocence and the woman who had captured his heart. 2 years later, Grace stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as Zach rode in from checking the northern pasture. The Wyoming territory had proved to be everything they had hoped for, a place of stunning beauty, hard work, and most importantly, a fresh start. Jim Hawkins, Zach's old friend, had been true to his word about the partnership. After a year of Zach proving himself as foreman, Jim had offered him a quarter share in the ranch. With their combined savings and a small loan from the bank in Cheyenne, they had purchased the share, becoming part owners of what was now the Hawkins and Everett Cattle Company. Their house, though modest, was a palace compared to Grace's room above the laundry. She had furnished it carefully, creating a warm home with handmade quilts, curtains she'd sewn herself, and furniture Zach had either built or traded for with neighboring ranchers. As Zach dismounted and led his horse to the barn, Grace smiled, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach where their first child grew. She hadn't told him yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news. But after a visit to the doctor in town yesterday, she could wait no longer. Zach emerged from the barn and spotted her on the porch, his face lighting up the way it always did when he saw her. Even after 2 years of marriage, his love showed no signs of dimming. If anything, it had deepened with each passing day. "There's my beautiful wife," he called, striding toward her with that easy cowboy gait that still made her heart skip. He bounded up the porch steps and gathered her into his arms, kissing her thoroughly. "Missed you today. You were only gone a few hours," Grace laughed, though she had missed him too. "Too long," he declared, keeping one arm around her waist as they entered the house together. "Jim's coming for supper tomorrow with that new schoolteacher he's sweet on. I told him your fried chicken would seal the deal." Grace smiled. "Playing matchmaker now, are we?" "Just returning the favor," Zach said with a wink. "If it weren't for Mrs. Patterson's meddling, who knows how long it would have taken me to get up the courage to ask you to that picnic?" "I think you would have found a way," Grace said confidently, moving to the stove where a stew simmered. "You were very determined once you set your mind to something." "Still am," Zach agreed, washing his hands at the basin before coming to help her set the table. It was one of the many things Grace loved about him, the way he never considered any task beneath him, the way they worked together as true partners. As they sat down to their meal, Grace gathered her courage. "I have some news," she said, watching his face carefully. Zach paused, a spoonful of stew halfway to his mouth. "What kind of news?" "The kind that means we'll need to add another place at the table in about 7 months, she said softly. For a moment, Zach looked confused. Then understanding dawned, and the spoon clattered back into his bowl as he stared at her in wonder. "Are you saying we're going to have a baby?" Grace confirmed, her eyes filling with happy tears at the joy that transformed his face. Zach was out of his chair in an instant, pulling her up into a careful embrace. "A baby," he whispered, one hand moving to rest reverently on her stomach. "Our baby." The awe in his voice made Grace laugh through her tears. "Yes, our baby. Doctor says everything looks perfect. I'm due in early spring." Zach kissed her, pouring all his love and happiness into the gesture. When they broke apart, he kept his arms around her, as if afraid she might disappear. "I didn't think I could be any happier than you've already made me," he said hoarsely. "I was wrong." That night, as they lay in bed together, Zach's hand protectively covering the barely there bump of their child, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that terrible day when she stood accused of theft with a gun to her head, to this moment of perfect contentment, it seemed almost like a dream. "What are you thinking about?" Zach murmured, echoing the question he had asked as they left Willow Creek 2 years ago. "I was thinking about how close I came to losing everything," Grace admitted. "If you hadn't been there that day, if you hadn't spoken up for me." "I'll always speak up for you," Zach promised, pulling her closer. "But you're stronger than you know, Grace. You would have found a way, with or without me." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I'm very glad it was with you." He pressed a kiss to her temple. So am I, my love. So am I. As they drifted toward sleep, Grace said a silent prayer of gratitude for the man beside her, the cowboy who had proved her innocence with his testimony, who had seen her worth when others saw only suspicion, who had given her not just his name, but a love beyond anything she could have imagined. They had faced judgment and fire, traveled hundreds of miles, and built a new life from the ashes of the old. And now, with their family growing, Grace knew that whatever challenges the future held, they would meet them together just as they had from that very first day in Willow Creek, when a stranger with kind blue eyes had stood between her and disaster, changing both their lives forever. The seasons turned, and spring brought not only new calves to the ranch, but also a daughter to the Everett household. They named her Elizabeth, after Zach's mother, with Nora as a middle name to honor Grace's Irish heritage. She had Zach's blue eyes and Grace's copper hair, and from her first breath, she was the center of their world. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm: cattle drives in the fall, harsh winters spent close to home, and glorious summers when the Wyoming prairie exploded with wildflowers. Their partnership with Jim Hawkins flourished, allowing them to expand their holdings and hire more hands. Grace found her place in this new world, not just as Zach's wife and Elizabeth's mother, but as a respected member of the growing community. Her skill with a needle led to a small side business making clothes and quilts for neighboring ranches. The extra money she earned went into a special account at the bank in Cheyenne savings for Elizabeth's education and for the siblings they hoped would join her in the years to come. As for the past, it rarely intruded on their happiness. Occasionally a letter would arrive from Mrs. Patterson, full of Willow Creek gossip, and invariably ending with a self-congratulatory reminder that she had always seen the potential in dear Grace. They learned that Deputy Miller had been sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison for the arson, though he had died of fever before serving half his term. Such news was received with quiet acknowledgement, but little emotion. That chapter of their lives was closed, the pain of it healed by the joy they had found together. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, after Elizabeth had been tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Zach led Grace out to the porch swing he had built when she was pregnant with their daughter. The summer air was warm, scented with sage and the roses Grace had planted along the front of the house. "Happy anniversary, my love," Zach said, handing her a small wrapped package. Grace smiled, giving him a similar package in return. Great minds think alike. They opened their gifts simultaneously, a delicate silver pocket watch for Zach, engraved with their wedding date, and for Grace, a locket containing a tiny portrait of Elizabeth on one side and Zach on the other. "It's perfect," she whispered, immediately putting it on. "So are you," Zach replied, drawing her close as they settled into the swing. "These 5 years with you have been the happiest of my life." Grace rested her head on his shoulder, watching as the setting sun painted the distant mountains gold and pink. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out? If you hadn't been in Mrs. Patterson's house that day, if you hadn't spoken up for me?" "Sometimes," Zach admitted. "But then I remember what my father used to say before things went bad, that a man makes his own destiny by the choices he makes. I chose to help you that day, not just because it was right, but because something in me couldn't bear to see you hurt." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Best choice I ever made." "For me too," Grace said softly. She hesitated, then added, "I have another gift for you, though it won't arrive for about 7 months. Zach went very still beside her, then turned to look at her with the same wonder she had seen 3 years earlier. "Really?" Grace nodded, smiling at his reaction. "Really. Doctor confirmed it yesterday." With a whoop of joy that probably woke Elizabeth and certainly startled the horses in the nearby corral, Zach lifted Grace into his arms and spun her around on the porch. "Another baby," he said, setting her gently back on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Our family is growing." "Just as we hoped," Grace agreed, her heart full to bursting with happiness. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, talking of the future, of their hopes for their children, of the life they continued to build together. And when Zach finally led her inside to their bedroom, the love they shared was as passionate and tender as it had been on their wedding night, a love born in adversity, tested by fire, and proven stronger than any challenge life could present. In the quiet after, As they lay tangled together beneath the quilt Grace had made for their marriage bed, Zach traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "You know what I was thinking about today, while I was out checking the herd?" "What?" Grace asked drowsily, content in his arms. "I was thinking about that day in Willow Creek, when everyone called you a thief. And I realized something I never told you." Grace tilted her head to look at him. "What's that?" Zach's eyes were serious in the dim light. "I didn't just save you that day. You saved me too." "How did I save you?" Grace asked, puzzled. "I came back to Willow Creek carrying so much anger at my father for what he'd done, at the town for how they'd treated my mother afterward, at myself for running away instead of staying to help her." His voice was soft but intense. "I was just going through the motions, working for Millbrook, not really living. And then I saw you, standing so brave and alone against all those accusations, and something woke up inside me." Grace touched his face gently. "I never knew." "They called you a thief," Zach continued. "But you're the one who gave everything back to me: purpose, hope, love. You made me whole again, Grace Everett." Tears pricked her eyes at the raw emotion in his voice. "And you did the same for me," she whispered. "You gave me a home when I had none, a name when mine was tarnished, a future when mine seemed lost." Zach gathered her closer, his kiss a promise renewed. "And I always will," he vowed, "for as long as I live." As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Grace knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future held, more children, the growth of their ranch, the inevitable challenges of life on the frontier, they would face it together, their love a testimony to the truth that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unlikely moments, and the truest wealth is measured not in gold or land, but in the hearts that beat as one beneath a starlit Wyoming sky.